Hello, and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we're stepping a little bit out of our usual range of topics, and we are doing a book review. We're reviewing The Secret History of Food, Strange But True Stories About the Origins of Everything We Eat by Matt Siegel, published last year in 2021.
Yes, and here's my oversimplified version before we go into a deep dive on it, is I really enjoyed the book. It is very well written and very easy to read. I thought the author was funny. He was also very sarcastic. I liked the fact that he seemed to always randomly make fun of British food, which at times that seems insulting, but at times it was spot on. The big thing I liked about this book is it makes me think. And this book really did make me think. Really, this book made me think I really should put a little vegetable garden in my backyard, mainly because much of the food we buy might not be all that we think it is. I also need to re-examine my diet. I'm ashamed to admit how much I eat at fast food restaurants, and that becomes very interesting on the chapter on fast food. But this author does take a very general and incredibly broad view of presenting history. If I did not know the subject matter, I thought the chapter was very, very interesting. But if I knew something about the chapter matter, there was a part of me that was saying, hold on, he's taking things out of context. He's cherry picking his information to make his point. His point might be right, but I think he's also confusing the matter where he's pulling it from and not detailing a true picture of that matter. And I will get into that when I go on a deep dive into chapter 2. But overall, I would give this book a 2 thumbs up. It's not academic, it's for the general person, and it is very entertaining.
It definitely is a very easy read. It's an entertaining read. As Alex said, there's definitely a lot of sarcasm in here. There are some great little asides, especially in the footnotes, where just a couple particular turns of phrase really capture your attention and make you think. Also, the chapter on honey was fairly disgusting, which now makes me really not want to eat honey, which is unfortunate because I do love it. But you do learn quite a lot in here. And again, it is a nice, just straight, easy read. So if you're looking for a great beach read that actually has some entertainment and educational qualities, highly recommend this one. But let's go ahead and do a deeper discussion into the topic of the book. Each chapter has a different focus and builds upon each chapter before, but we'll go into a thorough description of it. So chapter 1 really delves into a lot of evolutionary adaptations of hominids into anatomically modern humans and how food consumption was impacted and how that impacted us. So talking about lactase, being able to actually be lactose intolerant or tolerant, alcohol, which of course it's not natural, it's actually something that does come over time, where you actually are able to, one, you have fermented fruits, then you're able to actually handle the fermented fruits, the actual alcohol substance, the alcohol sugars. Then also the development of cooking, how that's going to impact basically chewing and swallowing, how that's also reshaping the human cranium with different sort of muscle attachments, having different bone attachments with the softer tissues, and then also how that might impact brain capacity. It's a bit of a gloss. It's a bit of a really fast-paced this, then this, then this, then this, then this, which is actually, of course, more ongoing, more simultaneous things evolving, happening. Again, kind of some cherry-picking going on, like Alex said. Covers an immense span of time. It covers very deep sense of time and all these things that are happening, and manages to do so in fewer than 15 pages. And that's why I have a little bit of a problem with it. But again, for the layman, it's not a bad synopsis. It just goes a little too broad on some very intricate, very, not necessarily controversial, but issues that have a lot more complexity than can be gone into in a brief synopsis like this. And now, Alex, how did you feel about chapter 2?
Well, chapter 2 was the chapter that annoyed me. It's really on apples, pies, pastry, fish, and stupid colonists. And basically what he was getting on is Americans in the 18th and 19th century ate a lot of pie. And this is true. This is a fact. He's not making this up. And that he gives a whole bunch of quotes about the revolution and eating apple pie. And he quotes F.W. Searle, who says, "The indomitable perseverance never fail in strength and don't know where you are, beaten courage is what you get when you eat apple pie, and it's exactly what you need to beat the British and win the American Revolution. There's a lot more that goes into this, and generally, the biggest thing is he gets on is about the crust, and he starts to describe the English meat pie, which has a crust made out of rye, which they call coffins. You can elaborately decorate them, and it sort of acts like Tupperware. And he mentions this is Tupperware. You don't eat that crust. Sometimes you can even reuse that crust. But these meat pies are cooked in a bake oven. And then he compares it to the American apple pie, which has a puff pastry type crust on it, which you can eat. It's very tasty, and is saying how this is much, much more superior. But there's a lot more that goes into that simple version of what the British are eating in colon pies and what the Americans are eating in colon pies. And I think you have to take a little bit deep dive and go back a little bit more. Most English homes up to about the 16th century were open right up to the roof. Generally, a one-room house, big hall, in the center is going to be a hearth, and the only thing that you really can cook is a big pot. And the British tended to eat something called pottage, which is really an oatmeal stew. And if they have other cooking implements, it probably is going to be a spit where you can roast some meat. The big change in housing comes in the Elizabethan age, and some people call this the Great Rebuilding of England. And one of the things that gets added on is chimneys. And also at the same time, this is where second stories, so the houses started to have multiple floor levels. When you have chimneys, a lot of homes started to have bake ovens. And generally, a bake oven is a beehive brick oven, which you heat up for about 3 to 4 hours to warm up all the bricks. And you can bake for about 5 to 7, sometimes even 9 hours, or even overnight. Sometimes these bake ovens will hold its heat. You tend to bake everything once a week. So the meat pies the British are making really are Tupperware type containers. You just eat the insides. It's a way of keeping it. When you go to cook the meat pies later in the week, you're just warming it up over the oven. Makes perfect sense. And he writes about this in a later chapter when he's talking about bread, how the difference about cooking over a bake oven and cooking bread on a daily basis makes a huge difference in the quality and taste of the bread. The next big improvement from a bake oven is a Dutch oven. And a Dutch oven is a cast iron pot with legs where you can put coals on the bottom and coals on the top, and you can bake in between. That is something you can bake every single day. And that is where the Americans started eating their apple pies and all other types of pies. It's made in a Dutch oven. It's made fresh daily. There's a big difference. The pastry they're using is puff pastry. The English, in a lot of the cookbooks they were using, there's one, Jervis Markham, who wrote a cookbook in 1615 called The Complete English Housewife, writes about puff pastries and says how you can use it on almost anything. And the English tend to put meat in almost everything. They tend to put fruit and meat in almost everything in the 17th century. They liked that taste of that savory taste and that tart taste combined together. And it seems to be in all sorts of recipes. So that's just a common style that's popular then. But they had and knew what puff pastry was, and they were making dishes to eat the pastry. He's trying to make a difference that, this is something that's American. It really isn't. It's something that they brought over, and when the technology changes, they went with the pastry that tastes much better, and the coffin type pastry went out of style. The second thing on this is he talks about how Americans love apples and they brought apple seeds over, and there's all these varieties, much more so than there are in England. What he fails to mention is when you plant an apple seed, you do not get the type of apple from what the seed came from. And so this is not a good way of making apples. Generally, you graft onto a root on the apple tree that you like, and that's how you move. So in Europe, they've already figured this out. They know the apples that make good cider. They know the apples that keep long. They know the apples that make good pies. So having 30 to 40 apple varieties is actually a lot for how they cook. In America, they have a lot more, and it takes them a lot of time to figure out which are the better varieties for doing different things. It makes new types of apples, but it doesn't mean all of the apples are good varieties. The other thing that we were getting into is he's talking a lot about how The early colonists didn't understand that they're going into a huge expanse of food, and they just didn't or unaware of them. And he uses an example of fish, how in Jamestown they tried to put a frying pan into the water to get some fish out because they didn't have nets or hooks. That's also taken out of context. There, one of the things that all of the writers, when they were talking about the rivers and streams at this time, is when the fish are spawning, there are so many fish. There is the iconic image of pictures of Indians standing in canoes with spears and hunting fish and just pulling them out. Even though John Smith writes that, I think it's like more to the sense that the fish were so thick that maybe if you put a frying pan in, you might be able to pull one out. The interesting thing on this is it's only certain types of the year that the fish are doing this. Other times it's going to be much more complicated. Those people knew how to fish. They knew that nets caught fish. One of the things that you can say about English people, they all live very close to the sea. They're great fishermen. A country that eats fish and chips all the time knows how to catch fish. Oh, and the last point that I was going to make on this one is there are so many complex issues that are going on in the 17th and 18th century in England and also in the colonies. And one of the things that I always like to say, it's the law of unintended consequences. And one of the things that the English settlers are doing, bringing apples over, bringing honeybees over, bringing farm animals over, bringing crops like wheat, barley, rye, oats, they are trying very much to change the environment in North America to be more like the English. He talks a lot about the food, the seafood, the different types of animals. But the longer they settled, the more people that came in, that changes, and that changes very quickly. He talks a lot about the amount of pigeons, so many that they block out the sun. There is speculation on that is a consequences of the changes that are taking place in the 17th century. As native populations are declining because of diseases, warfare against the settlers, people encroaching upon their land, they used to manage the environment around them. One of the things they did is they planted a lot of chestnut trees. So 1 out of every 4 trees in this area was an American chestnut. When their numbers died out, they're not harvesting chestnuts. All of a sudden, there's an explosion of animals that eat nuts and berries that the Indians were harvesting, but they're not harvested in that numbers. And they believe there was an explosion of birds, which is why they're blocking out the sun. And anyone can tell you when you start having an explosion, you're going to have a crash, and there is a crash soon after. And one of them is, I think, the Carolina passenger pigeon will, the most numerous bird early on, will go extinct in the 19th century.
All right, so chapter 3 is largely about the development of breakfast cereals. Not 100% pursuant to our time periods. It is a little bit later, towards the end of the 19th century, so we're going to skip that chapter. It's very interesting. Again, highly recommend the book. Unfortunately, this one just doesn't really pertain to what we talk about at the museum, so we're skipping it. On the other hand, chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with corn, the domestication thereof, and the uses and development of the land involving the corn, and also how prevalent corn is today in society. This chapter was extraordinarily surprising. So the chapter begins with basically a scathing gloss over the prehistoric domestication issue. Admittedly, it is a very dense topic, it has a lot of moving parts, it's very complex, and it's fairly difficult to describe in one short chapter where there are full textbooks devoted to this topic. But this chapter does mention major points like the terraforming involved in producing very large farms dedicated to corn, that in modern time periods we've actually created forced artificial growing seasons with chemicals that, of course, then create a haven for non-native weeds and pests, which require more chemicals to fight, so on and so forth in this vicious cycle. So that brings us up to the modern sense, and the fact that corn, being a early domesticate, particularly in the Americas, was based off of teosinte. Teosinte was not anything like our corn today. Domestication is still a question to a lot of archaeologists about exactly how we got from this basically grass with some hard kernels that were indigestible unless maybe popped, and how we got to that from maybe 10 to 12 kernels to our very heavy rows and rows of kernels, juicy kernels. So that's a very complex issue. He kind of goes into that a little bit. But the main point of this was how much modern food relies on corn. So it's linking the past with the present, where the colonists depended on corn to survive. And of course, the Iroquois way of cooking corn and growing corn was extraordinarily useful. So it does go into the fact that the Iroquois, or the Eastern Woodland method of growing corn that we've talked about before, was basically the method of intercropping, where you've got the corn, which is leaching the soil, grows up and serves as a pole for beans, which are then adding pockets of nutrients back in, largely via ammonia, by capturing nitrogen in the air. So you've got all of these plants working together. You've got the squash creating shade, keeping weeds down around the other two plants. So those are three plants that work together, and surprisingly, in the diet, then come out and actually work together to give you a full complement of amino acids that you cannot get just by eating corn or by eating beans or by eating squash discretely. When you eat them together, it's a very healthy diet that gives you the supplements that you need. Corn by itself is not nutritionally useful. There is absolutely no viable use for corn. So it's very interesting that also the Iroquois way of cooking, which is involves nixtamalization, which is basically cooking it in water that has wood ashes, which gives you wood lye. Basically, that's how you create hominy. And that actually opens up the hard casing. It actually converts into something that's digestible to extract the amino acid, extract niacin out of it. Surprisingly, once corn took over and was a major product throughout the 18th century in European, African, and colonial diets where it had never been before, the 18th century actually was plagued by a disease called pellagra. Pellagra is completely due to niacin deficiency, which is very interesting because, of course, the Indians weren't showing any sign of that. Yet the Europeans aren't cooking it the Iroquois way. They're not doing the nixtamalization. And they're depending on that as a main foodstuff when it's not really doing much for you except filling your belly. So pellagra is a nasty disease. It causes dementia, insomnia, sensitivity to light, diarrhea, often death. It has a telltale red and rough rash, especially on skin that's exposed to the light. For instance, like the neck, where you're out in the sun growing your corn, you have this niacin deficiency. The skin around your neck has what's called a necklace, named after the discoverer of it, and is actually going to have this red, rough, scaly appearance. And also, kind of interestingly, it goes into a kind of a link between the vampire myth, which comes up at the same time in the countries where corn is very heavily relied upon, and the appearance of this pellagra. So that's very interesting. Kind of a descent into problematic agriculture. So chapter 1, kind of discussion of how agriculture increases brain power, is becoming much more important, is actually doing good things. Chapter 4, the dependence on corn is causing some major problems. For example, in modern times, it's an estimation that the average American eats 3 pounds of corn every day from hidden sources. So it's a massively important ingredient in most foods. So it's in meat and dairy because it's animal fodder, or it's a sweetener, it's a starch, it's flour, stabilizers, binders, emulsifiers, preservatives, anticoagulants, flavorings, colorants, used for fermentation, used in gluten-free products, used on food wax for fruits. That's just the stuff we eat. That's not even the uses, the industrialized uses of corn. So adhesives, antibiotics, aspirin, xylene tiles, chalk, cork, cosmetics, crayons, disinfectants, dry cell batteries, engine fuel. That comes in as ethanol. So any gasoline with ethanol, which is most of the American gas, that's another use of corn. Fireworks, inks, plastics, rubber tires, soap, wallpaper glue, continually just everything you can think of has some relationship to corn. That's kind of a disaster ecologically and economically if we ever have a massive crop failure, and also in our diet. That's not a great thing to have. So this is a very interesting chapter that goes into all of that. And I think that's a very good, useful chapter for us because it does link the past with colonization, realizing that corn is a useful crop, dependence on corn, and how it's exploded and caused many, many problems. All right, not to downplay this book, of course, because we did enjoy it, and of course, the corn chapter was very useful. I did really enjoy the chapter on the history of celebrations and feasting. So Siegel kind of delves into the bizarre affectations of medieval feasting in this chapter that are such a hallmark of the period, and they're just so delightfully bizarre. So, for example, the coqs humeux, or helmeted cocks, I probably just butchered that French, which are basically roasted and stuffed chickens that are dressed in an actual metal helmet and carry a little gold or silver foil lance under their wing. Then they're perched on top of a roasted pig. So it looks like they're these dead birds that you're going to eat are riding into battle. That's really cute, right? Or they're also the more macabre, the cockatrice, which is either a pig head that is sewn onto the lower half of a chicken or a chicken head that's sewn onto the lower half of a pig. Why? Who knows? But it happened, and I think the excess described in this chapter is just bizarre. Why people in the medieval period decided to do this to food and thought that it was a great way of showing their largesse, no idea. But it is something that happened, and it's really interesting to read these details. So I enjoyed that chapter a lot.
The key to remember, the people who are doing that are the very, very wealthy.
Yes, it's definitely the wealthier, but it's also aspirational. The servants are seeing this food go out and they're telling other people, and so now it's kind of an aspiration to be able to do this random stuff, or putting some sort of fuel in a stuffed peacock's mouth and having flames come out of it, so it's somewhat of a phoenix on the table. It's just bizarre, but also creatively bizarre. So it's kind of interesting to read about that. Something that's really disgusting to read about are the facts and figures of the modern American fast food diet. And I quote, more than 36% of Americans consume fast food daily, increasing to 80% monthly and 96% annually. That turns my stomach and makes me very ill. And I really didn't want to read this rest of this chapter about how food choices have actually caused more problems than they're worth.
And what's interesting on that chapter is how the fast food restaurants are driving what food is produced. So even if you're not going to a fast food restaurant, you are still have to eat the food that they want. So an example is McDonald's and potatoes. The type of potatoes McDonald's want is the majority of potatoes we eat and the majority of potatoes we actually buy in the grocery store. It's also the same with tomatoes, that they need tomatoes that are not going to bruise, that look red. They might not have a good taste. And one of the things he makes a point out is at first, fast food, you got what you got. There was no changes. You couldn't say, I want a Big Mac, and then rearrange it, because that would upset the line and it would make it much more expensive. Then it seemed to be that in the 70s, they started to go, and this is something that Burger King is, with the advertisement, have it your way. And a lot of times these food experts are talking about more choice makes people happier. And he uses an example of ragu and tomato sauce or spaghetti sauce. You could make like the best spaghetti sauce, but this person was saying, would want a choice. So some might want it chunky, some might not want it chunky, some might want more garlic, some might want peppers and onions in it. Some would want more basil. So one of the things he recommends is that you have much more choices. And so that's what you get. But what you don't understand is all of it is made with the same tomatoes. There's not a lot of difference. You think you're getting the choice, but in the end, you're really not. And that was something that I found very depressing. And it also, how they present the food, especially as Rachel has mentioned before, to putting the wax on some of the fruit that's out there, or what vegetables get put on the display. There's a sort of words where they're looking for the sexy fruit or the sexy vegetable rather than the ones that taste well. It was a depressing chapter, which is why I was saying that I now really want to start a garden so I can grow some fresh food to see if I notice the difference.
And this also goes along with changes between past and present is how much food waste we have, especially because we're selecting on the basis of appearance of our produce. In the past, they didn't have that choice. The early colonists, they would have been grateful for anything that was growing. So the fact that we have so much waste just because it's not an attractive looking cucumber, it might be slightly shriveled, or there's a black spot on that tomato, is rather appalling, honestly. The one thing that I found kind of interesting is in the chapter discussing chili. So towards the end of the book, Siegel starts talking about chilies and the evolutionary traits that lead us to understand that we're basically being attacked by a chemical weapon when we eat chilies. I found it interesting that he doesn't actually discuss the African origins. There's a lot of Eurocentrism in this book that I do find a little concerning. Again, it is talking mostly about Americans, it's talking about American food, but a lot of our food does come from other places, and a lot of even things that we consider truly Southern are basically actually originally African. And it's not really something that's picked up in the narrative of this book, which I found kind of interesting, especially one that's talking about the history of food. So yes, of course, on an overview book, you can't go into a whole lot of detail, but if you're going back to talking about the evolution, the actual anatomical evolution of what led us to be able to taste all of the chilies and the capsaicin and how much we can taste per parts per million, we could also mention the origins of those foods as well.
And the other thing you mentioned on the chilies, which I would question, and I don't think this is true, where he sort of sidelines it very quickly, that people spiced up foods to make meat last longer or to disguise meat that's gone bad. Everything I read seems to say that's not the case, that people like spicy food because they like spicy food. It has nothing to do with the quality of the meat.
That's one of those lingering myths that we do deal with. So if you like myth busting, go on back and listen to our myth busting episode from last season, because that definitely is one of those lingering ones that we do hear quite often. If you're having bad meat, you're not going to eat the bad meat because you will have a visceral reaction to that that makes it not worth the effort of eating the meat.
Well, we picked out some pretty critical things on for Matt Siegel, but for the most part, we actually really enjoyed this book. It was a good book. It did make you think. He does gloss over, but that's it. In many ways, this is not a history book. This is just an interesting book. And when you read this book, you might say, wow, maybe I should read something a little bit more in depth about food. There is a real interest in history to it.
So yes, overall, 2 thumbs up from both of us. It's a very good read. And again, nice and light. It has really good flow, good pacing. Definitely some really snarky asides, especially about modern American modes of production of food and consumption. So yeah, we highly recommend this book, and we hope you enjoyed the episode.
Well, thank you for listening, and if you're in the area, please come and visit the museum. We have a lot of special events coming up, which I'll have Rachel describe.
So our next event is going to be our Juneteenth event, which will actually be Saturday, June 18th. And we're going to have many community groups in the area coming out and actually participating in our Juneteenth celebration. So we'll be doing lots and lots of activities, especially focused on the blending of African culture into what we consider an American culture, the contributions of Africans into that, especially talking about food, since that's the topic of this episode. So that'll be coming up. And then, of course, July 4th, which will be coming up rather quickly now that we're into full summer. So we hope to see you at some of those events. And if you do like this episode, or if you have enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you.